Greetings and welcome to the CCOF Foundation Organic 101 for Small and Mid-Sized Farms webinar. We're very excited to have you here with us this afternoon. Today's webinar will review the steps necessary to obtain organic certification for crop production through the USDA National Organic Program. It is part of our Farmers Marketing Tools for Success series that provides tips and tools for farmers to strengthen their sales and income at farmers markets. Organic certification is just one of many tools local farmers selling directly to consumers may use to draw in customers and increase their revenue. At the end of this webinar, we will highlight additional webinars in this series. Funding for the series was provided by the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. Please note the contents of the webinar do not necessarily represent the official views of the USDA. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear or can't see, please call our office at support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. My name is Megan Donovan and I will be your host today. I'm a program specialist at the CCOF Foundation. The CCOF Foundation advances organic agriculture for a healthy world through education and hardship grants, technical assistance, and consumer education. Before we get started today, I wanted to let you know how you can participate in today's event. We're looking at an example of the GoToWebinar attendee interface, which is made up of two parts. The viewer window on the left, which allows you to see everything the presenter will share on the screen, and the control panel on the right. Within the control panel is how we can participate in today's event, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. By clicking on the orange arrow, you can open and close the control panel. From the view menu, you can also set the control panel not to auto-hide when inactive if you prefer to always keep it open. By default, you have joined the webinar via mic and speakers. If you prefer, you can join the audio via telephone by selecting phone call, and the dial-in information will be displayed. During the presentation, you can send questions to our webinar staff through the questions pane. Simply type in your question and click send. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and everyone will receive an email with a link to view the recording of today's event along with the PDF of the PowerPoint slides. Today, we also have a copy of the PDF of the PowerPoint slides available for download through GoToWebinar. Click on the blue file name in the handouts pane and a PDF of the slides will appear in your browser. You can click on them or you can view them in your browser or download them onto your computer. To expand or collapse the handouts and questions pane, click on the triangle next to the name of the pane. For example, if you can't see the box in the questions pane, click on the triangle and it will expand in the pane to show the box. So we want to encourage you to write in. Let us know where you're calling in from today and what you produce on your farm, or if you're just getting started farming, what you are planning to produce. And we'll get back to that a little bit later in the presentation. And just to let you know, we have a really good crowd today, which is great. So we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible, but we wanted to apologize in advance if we can't get to your specific question and encourage you to follow up after the webinar. We'll provide you with some contact information. So thanks again for being here today. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Rebecca Silver. Rebecca is a farm certification technical specialist at CCOF. She has worked for CCOF since 2007 as a certification reviewer and supervisor, as well as developed CCOF's Spanish language services and Mexico program. Prior to joining CCOF, Rebecca earned a master's degree in environmental studies with a focus of sustainable agriculture from the University of Oregon. She has worked on organic farms in Oregon and Chile. So Rebecca, thank you so much for being with us, here with us this afternoon, and I will hand things over to you.
All right, thank you, Megan, and thanks everyone for taking some time out of your day. I hope we'll all leave today's webinar with some useful information that you can take with you to whatever context you work in. So we're going to start with a poll, and you should see this.
Yeah, it'll show up on your screen in just a second.
It's coming.
So if you want to take a look, let us know from a scale of 1 to 5 how you rate your level of knowledge on organic certification. Are you an expert? Are you a novice? Somewhere in the middle? Just so we can get a sense of who's in the audience today. And we're going to wait a minute or two just to let people have a chance to fill in the poll. And it looks like we have critical mass, so a couple more. All right, so I'm gonna close the poll in about 2 seconds. If you haven't voted yet, please do. So I'm gonna close the poll and then kind of share it with everybody. And you take a look. Looks like we have about 26% novice, 30% intermediate, and about 13% expert, and then some other folks kind of in between.
Great. So this webinar is geared to the 101 level, sort of an introductory presentation. So looks like a lot of you are ready for just that kind of information. And if you're finding yourself someone who knows a little bit more about the information that I'm presenting on, I just encourage you to check out some of our other webinars that we offer. You can browse around on our website, and we have a lot of other more in-depth information you might find useful. There will be links at the end of the presentation, or you can browse around anytime. So with that, let's get into an overview of what we're going to cover today. We'll start with a look at what certified organic means and the definition of organic and how it's regulated. Then we'll get into some of the benefits of organic certification for small to mid-sized farms in particular, especially those with local sales like farmers markets. And then we'll cover some topics that are really important to consider when you're beginning the certification process. And those are cost, land eligibility, and the actual steps that will be involved in the process. We'll take a question break after that, and then we'll dive into a detailed look at the organic regulations for crop production. We'll share some helpful resources, web links you can take away from today, and then Megan will wrap up after we do some final questions. All right, so what is certified organic? So first of all, organic is a federally regulated labeling term. It differs from more broad terms like natural in that a certified organic claim has third-party verification from a certifier. And the process of certification ensures that everything that's labeled as organic meets the USDA National Organic Program regulations. So the acronym there is NOP, National Organic Program. You'll hear me saying that a whole bunch more throughout the presentation. The NOP regulations were put into place in 2002, and certifiers such as CCOF and many others are accredited by the USDA to certify to these regulations. A little history behind all of that is that organic farmers actually lobbied for regulations to create a level playing field as to what organic means. And that was part of what drove the implementation of the NOP in 2002. Before 2002, there wasn't a consistent standard for what organic meant across the country. So there were some states like California and other states that had their own regulations, but those were not applicable across the entire country. And even before that, before there were any state regulations in place, there were non-governmental organizations like CCOF that created their own organic standards. So organic has a long history in terms of the regulatory structure. But let's back off from all of that bureaucratic talk and talk about what it actually means to grow crops organically under the NOP regulations. First of all, an organic crop production system is defined in the regulations as one that responds to site-specific conditions by integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster the cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. There's also a heavy emphasis on maintaining or improving natural resources, including soil and water, as a general requirement for becoming organic, certified organic, and using that term in the United States to market your products. So to put it another way, organic is based on management practices that restore, maintain, and improve the ecological conditions of the operation. And I know that there's a lot of focus on public perception out there that organic is really about the input materials, the fertilizers and pesticides. I want to buy organic because those toxic pesticides weren't used or something like that. Might be something that a consumer would say. But what I want to highlight here is that organic farming is much more than just substitution of the organic approved inputs for conventional ones. It's really about that larger ecological picture. So the benefits of organic certification. You all probably know these just as well as I do, if not better, but we'll highlight a few. First of all, farming without synthetic fertilizers and pesticides can help avoid the negative impacts of those substances, whether you're talking about environmental impacts or impacts on human health, starting with the farmer and farm workers to neighboring communities and even the final consumer. And then secondly, organic farms use practices that protect natural resources like soil and water quality and promote biodiversity. And these really, they aren't really just buzzwords, they're really part of creating a successful organic system. So for example, an organic farm that's creating habitat for beneficial insects is definitely increasing biodiversity, but more importantly for the farmer, those beneficials are playing a role in helping the farmer reduce pesticide use. So those practices are part of a larger whole. Third, genetically modified organisms, otherwise known as GMOs, are prohibited in organic. So the end result for a certified organic product is a product that's free of GMOs. And organic certification is going to allow you to signal to consumers who value all of the things that I've highlighted already that your product aligns with their values. And of course, finally, as you know, there's typically a price premium for organic versus non-organic. So farms with local sales can use certification as a tool to increase revenues, for example, in farmers markets. And the organic certificate can help local producers expand into new market opportunities. For example, perhaps you would expand to sales with a wholesale buyer who requires organic certification. So back to the regulatory perspective, as I've already touched on, certification allows you to use organic logos and marketing claims for a product sold in the United States to be in compliance with the NOP regulations. And these claims and logos are going to communicate to the consumer that you have the backing of third-party verification, that being the backing of the certification agency. I do want to highlight that farms that gross less than $5,000 in annual organic sales are exempt from being certified organic in order to use the word organic in their marketing. But if you're grossing more than $5,000 in annual organic sales, you have to be certified to use that word. And more than that, you can only use the USDA organic logo, which you see here, and the logo of your certifier only if you're certified. So pictured at the bottom of the screen is an example certifier logo. That's CCOF's logo, and we are one of over 50 different organic certifiers based in the United States that are accredited to certify to the NOP standards. So in the end, organic certification is a business decision that you are going to need to make for your own operation. There's certainly farms that say, now is not the right time for me, or organic isn't the right path for me at this point. Our goal today is to give you enough information to be able to make that decision. All right, so moving on to some of the important topics when starting out. The most common question, and also a very important one that we get from farms considering certification, is the cost. How much is this going to cost? So the answer is that it varies. That's the short answer. I'll give you the long answer now. At CCOF, we're really striving to provide cost-effective services for farms of all sizes. So the way our fees work is they increase with your organic production value in tiers. And at CCOF, we generally see annual certification costs for small farms run anywhere between $600 and $800 annually. In the first year, there is an additional one-time only application fee of $325 for submitting your application. Again, this is just a ballpark for smaller farms. So that leads me to the main point, which is that certifiers differ in how they determine fees. So it really pays to do your homework and contact certifiers to get estimates for your operation. And I'll give you some links at the end to help you do that. The good news when it comes to the costs is that there is cost share funding available. This is a federally funded program authorized under the Farm Bill, and it can help lower the economic barrier to obtaining certification. Any operation that's certified organic in the United States is eligible to apply, and the process is fairly simple. There's an application form. You would include a copy of your certificate, receipts for certification bills, and there's an additional tax form that's required to round out your application packet. And in California, the deadline to apply is October 31st of each year, so we're getting real close. So anyone out there who's already certified and hasn't applied, that's your homework. Payment typically arrives in January or February of the following year. And we really do like to encourage everyone who is certified with CCOF to apply, and any certified organic operation to apply, so that that funding can be used and continue to be available in the future. So how much can you receive from this program? The maximum is a reimbursement of up to 75% of your costs, your certification costs, up to $750. But that is per scope. So the scopes you see listed at the bottom of the slide, there's crop production, livestock, processing and handling, wild crop harvest, and finally the California State Organic Registration, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. It's a separate requirement for California operations in California selling as organic. So just for example, if you have crops and livestock, you would actually be eligible for up to $1,500, assuming that that is 75% of your certification cost. Here's an example just to break the math down a little bit more. Let's say you run a mixed fruit and vegetable farm in California and you gross $50,000 a year in organic sales. You have two scopes that you're going to be eligible for: crop production and the California State Organic Registration. So just for example, and keep in mind that all the numbers you see here on this slide are just examples for the purposes of breaking down the math. Let's say the organic certification fees, which include the inspection costs, total $1,000. You're going to be eligible for a cost share reimbursement of 75% of that, up to $750, so the full $750 in this case, which brings your certification cost down to $250 net after you receive that reimbursement. Then let's say the state registration is $75. Again, you're eligible for 75% of that, up to $750. So in this case, you're going to receive $56.25 of reimbursement, bringing your state registration expenses down to $18.75 once you receive that reimbursement. And then you can see in the totals that this operation is paying out $1,075 of total costs, but once they receive their reimbursement, the net costs have been reduced down to $268.75. So let's say you've done your homework on costs, you've found a certifier, and you are ready to get started. The next question that often comes up is, what about the 3-year land transition? And this is starting to get a little bit into the regulations themselves, but I want to talk about it up front because it's such a key question for farms that are transitioning to organic. One of the key requirements of the NOP regulations is a 3-year period in which the land has no prohibited substances applied to it. So those substances that are prohibited include synthetic fertilizers and the majority of the pesticides and other materials used in non-organic farming. in general, to establish the eligibility date of your field for organic certification, you'll need to provide documentation showing what input materials were applied to the land during that transition period, what the uses of the land were during that transition period, et cetera. But beyond that, there's actually a lot of variability about how farms approach this part of the certification process. So I wanted to break that down for you here. And in this table, we're looking at 3 common factors that farms are considering in terms of how they manage this 3-year transition period. And the point here is that there's a number of different ways you could go about it. So in the first row of the table, we're thinking about the land use during the 3-year period. One way that some farms approach it is for that land to sit fallow, be in pasture, or in some other way be managed such that there are really no inputs being applied. Another way is to actually be farming the field, producing crops, but use organic practices, meaning organic approved input materials, and then selling the crops as non-organic during that 3-year transition. Either way can definitely lead to obtaining certification. There's not one right way. Those are 2 possible pathways, 2 common pathways that we see. A second factor down in the second row is who's managing or controlling the land. So some operations have land that they manage and control during the entire 3 years, and this means that when they apply for certification, they themselves are able to attest to the land use and the material applications. But other farms buy or lease land that has already undergone some or maybe all of the transition period by the time they take control of it, and in that case, they end up obtaining documentation from the previous owner or manager that attests to what materials were applied during that transition period. So again, either way, there's a possibility to obtain certification. There's not one right way. And finally, the timeline in terms of when you apply for certification. So some operations, I would say most, choose to wait until near the end of the 3 years to apply for certification. And the obvious advantage here, and reason that this is more common, is the cost savings. But there are other farms that prefer to apply for certification during the transition or even near the beginning. And these operations have their inspections and complete all aspects of the certification process during that time and until the transition ends and they receive a certificate. And this is the sort of the play it safe approach, because in this scenario, the farmer has the advantage of oversight from the certifier. So for example, if he or she is planning to apply any materials during the transition for crop production happening during that time, the certifier can approve and vet those materials. So that's sort of the insurance policy, if you will. So down in red there at the bottom, discuss your situation with potential certifiers. I highly recommend that you do this if you feel like you're in a little bit of the gray area between some of these scenarios. And there's lots of different ways that we see people approach this. All right, our final topic before we take a question break is the steps to certification. So starting here with an organic system plan. This is a written plan that you would complete in order to apply for certification, and it demonstrates how you plan to comply with the NOP regulations. And I'm going to you'll hear me say the acronym OSP later on and right now, which is the acronym for Organic System Plan. Each certifier has its own OSP forms, and they'll look different by certifier, but they are essentially collecting the same type of information, which is information that allows the certifier to confirm whether you have the ability to comply with the regulations. So things like your field location, the eligibility of the land that we just talked about, what crops you're growing, the types of seed and planting stock you're using, soil management practices, input materials, and sort of all the way down the line through to any post-harvest handling that you might be doing and how you keep records. So when you've completed the organic system plan, that is what you submit to your certification agency. Usually there is an application fee at this point in the process. I mentioned that at CCOF, the fee is $325 and it's one time only, but remember, fee structures vary by certifier. Then the certifier is going to do a preliminary review of the application to confirm that you appear to have the ability to comply, and I'm saying that part in quotes, maybe you could hear that, because it's exactly what the regulations say, and though it may sound sort of vague, there's actually a really important reason that we're doing that preliminary review. It's really key to making sure that an applicant who's not yet ready for the inspection doesn't move on to that stage. For example, if there's a question about a material that was used during the transition period and whether or not it's allowed, or if it appears that the applicant maybe doesn't have much understanding at all of how to meet the regulations, that applicant is not ready to move forward to the inspection stage. So I want to stress here that this process shouldn't be mysterious either. And you may be surprised here that certifiers are actually required to help applicants understand the regulations so that they comply. So don't hesitate to get on the phone and ask questions if you find yourself with questions during the application process. On the other hand, also know that we can't be your consultant. So while we can explain what the regulations say about seed or crop rotation or anything else, we can't tell you exactly what kind of seed to plant or what specifically your crop rotation plan should be. So an applicant that is not ready to move to the inspection stage is not done with the process. They have the opportunity to work through the issues and questions that were brought up and move forward in the process. And that brings me to the asterisk that you see here on this slide. This is to highlight that this is a stage in the process where your certifier may have questions for you. And to avoid delays, it's really in your best interest to respond as quickly and completely as you can so that your application keeps moving. Next in the steps to certification is the inspection. So the primary objectives of the inspection are, number one, to verify whether the OSP is being implemented. So to verify that what you wrote down in your plan is what you're actually doing. And secondly, to verify whether all the practices that you use are in compliance with the regulations. So the inspector is going to do this by walking the fields with you, reviewing your OSP, looking at your records and your overall system for keeping records. They're going to look at your input material storage, your irrigation system, and much more. And that'll be dependent on your operation and the specifics of your operation. The inspector's job is really to verify, observe, and identify issues of concern. But a common misconception about the inspection process is that the inspector makes the final decision. That's not actually the case. The inspector leaves you at the end of the inspection with a written summary of issues of concern and any missing information, and that's called the exit interview. And you can see it here on the slide. But that is not the final certification decision. The exit interview does have an asterisk because, again, this is another point in the process where you may be asked for some additional information or clarification. The inspector might note that there was a missing record of some kind, or that it wasn't clear the full name of a particular fertilizer you used. So again, responding quickly and completely is important, and don't hesitate to ask questions if there's something you're not sure about. And just to highlight the cost piece, again, the inspection is another stage where fees are generally billed to cover inspection costs. And of course, every certifier does that differently, but CCOF, at CCOF, we calculate inspection costs based on inspector time and expenses. So the next stage is where the certification does get made, and that's the inspection report review. Again, on the cost side at CCOF, this is the point when we actually invoice a new applicant their first year annual certification fee. But other certifiers may do this at a different point in the process or use different fee structures entirely. So the certification reviewer's job is to review the inspection report alongside the organic system plan and the NOP regulations themselves to determine whether the operation meets all the requirements. And often there's clarification needed during the review. So the reviewer would send a request to that operation for specific information. And so there you go. There's that asterisk again. But finally, the certification decision is issued once that information is received, or if there wasn't any information needed. And if the operation is in compliance, that's when they receive their organic certificate. I did put an asterisk here because the certification decision might actually be that certification couldn't yet be granted. And in that case, of course, you'll want to respond quickly and completely to resolve the outstanding issues and get the certificate. I want to stress also that this isn't a one-time only pass or fail type of exam. Those are pretty stressful for all of us, and that's not what this is. If certification isn't granted, it's usually because there's some kind of missing information or a question that can be resolved. That's what we see in the majority of cases. Common examples of that are, like I mentioned earlier, providing the full name of a material that was used during the transition, or demonstrating that you have a structure in place to keep records. Only rarely the issues are really major, such that they can't be resolved and certification is denied because the applicant is unable to comply with the regulations. So that's certainly a possible outcome, but in the majority of cases where the certificate was not immediately issued, there's something that can be resolved. Sometimes we also find that we ask for more information and never get a response, so that's another possible outcome. At CCOF, the entire process usually takes about 90 days or more, but again, this can stretch a little longer if there's delays in hearing a response back from the applicant, where we see the asterisk in the charts. And other certifiers would be able to give you a more direct estimate of their own estimated timelines. So the organic certificate is valid until it's surrendered by the operation or until it's suspended or revoked by the certifier. That's another way of saying that there's not an expiration date on the certificate, but you do have to continue to complete the annual inspection and review cycle in order to remain in compliance and avoid suspension or revocation, because either of those might result without having an annual inspection, without providing any information that's needed to complete that inspection review, and without keeping current on the annual certification fees. So those three things together are the components of the annual certification cycle, which continues indefinitely. All right, at this point, we're going to look at some pictures of onions and take some questions.
All right, so yeah, we want to open it up for questions. Feel free to type it in and send them in. And we did have a couple questions come in during your presentation. And just a note too, we're going to kind of get into more depth in the second half of the presentation about what all the organic requirements are. So if you have specific questions about what does organic say about soil management, we'll get to those in the second half. But if you have any clarifying questions about what we just covered, we can hit on those now. And someone wrote in and just asked that you could repeat what the certification fees are, or kind of like the range again.
Yeah, so that range that I mentioned earlier was really just a ballpark estimate for small farms, which is $600 to $1,800 is approximately what we tend to see small farms having as their total annual cost. For a first-time applicant, there would also be that $325 application fee I mentioned. The reason there's such a range is, well, there's two reasons actually. First, our fees are on a tiered schedule, which you can find on our website. If you just go to our website and type fees into the search box, it'll bring you right there. The tiers increase as your organic sales increase. Secondly, the inspection cost is on a per hour basis. That's how it's billed, based on the inspector's time for the actual inspection and completing the report, as well as their travel expenses. So that's going to differ not only based on how big your operation is, how complex, how prepared you are for the inspection, what kind of issues come up at the inspection, and just location, logistics kind of stuff. So I hope that is a good sort of
Great.
non-answer of not pinning down a specific number, but we can give you a specific estimate for your operation.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of reiterate what Rebecca said in her presentation, that other certifiers have different fee schedules and they do things a little differently. So, calling a couple of certifiers and getting some quotes on what your operation might look like would be a good way to get a good kind of rounded view of how much the certification might cost. And then someone also asked, what is the premium in price that one can expect to obtain for organic versus conventional produce? And I know the USDA publishes organic prices, so that's something that we could send out in the follow-up email, but is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, that's exactly the answer I was thinking of, Megan. Thank you. Yeah, that's not data that we track or have, but you could certainly check out the USDA price report that we'll send out.
Great. So also had a couple more questions. Are aquaponic farmers eligible for certification?
Yeah, aquaponics is eligible for organic certification, as you probably are considering. If you are an aquaponic producer, there's going to be some, it's the way the regulations are written is not specifically written directed at aquaponics. So we do have the ability to certify aquaponics, and happy to work with anyone on that process, and the other certifiers would be able to do the same. It's not specifically excluded from the regulations.
Great, thank you. And this next question, I think may get to a little bit later in the presentation, but someone was wondering what documents need to be updated to continue certification after the first year of certification is granted.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I will talk about that a little bit more later, but the basic answer is that your organic system plan needs to be kept up to date, meaning if anything that you wrote down in your original plan has changed or you're planning to make a change to it, you would want to update that document, send it to your certifier, and get the okay from them before you move forward with that change.
Okay, great. And I think we have one more question here. They're just getting started and was wondering if there's example organic systems plans or kind of any assistance sort of on that end of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, if you look at CCOF's website, you'll be able to see our whole organic system plan for growers. And so you wouldn't need to develop anything additional beyond what those forms are asking you for. And then each certifier has their own set of organic system plan forms. And again, those are going to cover all of the information that the certifier needs to evaluate your practices for compliance. You don't need to go out and develop an additional document. The National Organic Program, I believe, also might have some sample OSP templates on their website. We can check into that and send that link out as well.
Great. And just to note, we have a bunch of resources at the end of the webinar too that will highlight some that we've talked about and then others as well. So I think we're going to wrap it up for questions for now, but if you have anything that comes up during the next part of the presentation, feel free to just keep writing them in, and we'll have time for more questions at the end of the presentation.
All right, moving right along. Here we go into the technical stuff, the regulations themselves. So we're going to cover the topics that you see here on this slide, which covers the basic points for crop production. I want to just give the caveat right now that we're not getting into any other scopes. We're not getting into any post-harvest handling, any multi-ingredient processing. We're not getting into livestock, etc. So if you have that type of operation, feel free to contact us or any other certifier for information on those standards. I also want to highlight that in the bottom left of the slide, you'll see the citation to the NOP standards themselves, and I'll give you the link to the standards at the end of the presentation. But as we move through the next set of slides, you'll see a specific citation from 7 CFR Part 205 for the specific topic. So you'll see 205 dot something, and that's the section of the organic regulations that deal with the topic at hand, for those that like that kind of thing. So the organic system plan is where we're going to start. We've been talking about it a lot. It's a description, as I mentioned, of the practices that you plan to follow to meet the NOP regulations, and each certifier's specific set of forms are going to look different, but they're going to cover the same information, and they're going to be asking the questions that the certifier needs the answers to see if you have a compliant plan, if you have that ability to comply. So the example page that's pictured is the first page of CCOF's OSP for growers. It's actually really just a checklist. It's give us a brief description of who you are and what your operation is, and then go through this checklist and look at what activities you do, and then that's going to direct you to which additional forms are relevant for your operation. So we try to set it up in a way that is really user-friendly, and you can find your way to the next piece of the puzzle. And the OSP is sort of a living document is how we talk about it, and this gets back to one of the questions we just had, which means that an operation is going to update it as they determine changes they plan to implement. At CCOF, we don't require each operation to recomplete the whole set of forms every year. Other certifiers may require that either at your annual inspection or to renew certification. But what we ask at CCOF is that you just send us any updates as you're planning them, and just the pages that are relevant to those changes, not the whole set of forms. But I do want to stress that any changes that you are planning once you become certified need to be reviewed by your certifier before you implement them. And again, it's an insurance policy for you, not only a way of complying with the regulations, but it really gives you assurance that the change won't put your certification at risk. So a common example is a farm that plans to use a new pest control material. And unfortunately, if you use a prohibited pest control or any other prohibited material, even if you do it by accident, this could result in loss of certification for 3 years. So you can see why it's really important to have that change checked out before you implement it or apply the material. And then the final piece of the organic system plan is that it's verified during each inspection, not only the initial inspection, but each inspection thereafter, and the inspector is continuing to check that you're implementing your OSP and that it complies with the regulations. And as we talked about, there may be more updates at that point in time, and the process continues on that annual cycle. All right, another really fundamental requirement for organic certification is natural resources, that your farming practices maintain or improve the natural resources of your operation, including the soil and water quality. And this is going to look different in practice for every operation. As you might imagine, there are site-specific differences for every single operation. You may have a lot of opportunities at your particular site, or it may be more constrained if you're leasing land from somebody else, or just depending on where your field is located. But I've got some examples here on the slide of common practices that farms implement to meet this requirement. So planting hedgerows to increase biodiversity, planting flowering plants to attract pollinators, and maintaining vegetation along riparian zones to protect and stabilize those areas, and then cover cropping to improve the soil. There are also a lot of great resources available on natural resource management for organic farms, including some great opportunities for technical assistance and funding to implement conservation practices. So I'll share those in the links at the end of the presentation. Now, some of you may be wondering, and I saw on our attendee list, there's a lot of you out there who work in food safety. You might be wondering about how this topic crosses over and interacts with food safety requirements. And the good news on that is that we use the term co-management to talk about practices that both comply with food safety requirements and also meet the organic regulations in terms of maintaining or improving natural resources. And we do see that this is not only possible, but it's going on at many, many organic farms all over California and beyond. And some certifiers offer food safety programs in addition to organic. So I'll share a link on co-management for food safety at the end in the resources. Okay, next up is records. Now this one usually gets saved for last in your typical organic 101 type overview, but I wanted to put it right up front because it's really important to the certification process, and I think it's often one that causes people a little hesitation, feeling like it is very complicated, but it may not be as complicated as you might expect. So the requirement is that records need to document all activities and transactions on an organic operation. They need to be kept for 5 years minimum, and they have to be available to be reviewed at inspections. Just a side note that this is one of the reasons it really pays to be organized and well prepared with your records so that your inspection can be smooth. But the last thing about what the regulations say for records is that they should be adapted to your particular operation. And so what that means is that there's not one specific right way to keep records. Each operation can develop its own system that works within that operation. So this is where I think record keeping can become a little less daunting once you recognize that you don't have to do it a certain way. You need to do it in the way that works for your operation. And how that plays out is that we see everything from, the computerized tracking systems to apps to the kind of old-fashioned hard copy stuff you see in this in the photos. There's still a place for the old hard copy and manila envelope and file folder system in organic record keeping if that's what works for your operation. And I've also heard of, other creative solutions like, throughout the day, the farm has a whiteboard in the shed where they're writing down, what they planted, what they harvested, whatever other activities took place that day. And then at the end of the day, just snap a photo. And then all those photos make up your records of your activities during the farming day. So I like to highlight that last one because I think it underscores the point that first of all, it doesn't have to be an extra added challenge, and it can also be built into the daily management routine you already have, which will make it easier and more habitual. So that said, on this slide is a list of the most common types of records that farm operations tend to need to keep. Again, these are typical for most farm operations, but what you will actually end up needing to keep is going to be dictated by your specific operation and what you do. So we've got input, application records, and purchase receipts for any inputs that you purchase. A whole manner of records related to seed, planting stock, and transplant, starting with receipts and seed search logs for seed and planting stock, and then organic certificates and receipts for any annual seedlings or transplants you use. Planting and crop rotation records, natural resource management records, harvest records, and shipping or sales records. And I'll give you links to sample forms at the end of the presentation, and those are sample forms that any organic operation can use and adapt to their own specifics. And what you see pictured here is a sample load list for farmers market sales. So this is documenting, it's actually documenting both the harvest and the sales in one place, which is completely fine. Doesn't have to be, even though I've got it in 2 separate bullet points on the slide, it doesn't have to be 2 separate pieces of paper. So a farmers market operation would record what they harvested and then either what they sold at the market that day or even just the quantity that was remaining at the end of the day. And from that, you can do the math and see how much was sold. Another example of how the records might be adapted to your operation. Okay, now moving on to land. We've been here already and covered the basics about how you might maneuver the 3-year transition. Now getting into what you would actually provide in your OSP, and I think this speaks to one of the questions we had. So for each location where you plan to produce organic crops, you're going to need to provide, first of all, just basic information about, where the field is, its acreage and borders. This is going to generally involve a map, and then the crops you grow. Then you're going to need to provide land history documentation to establish the eligibility date of the parcel. So that date is 3 years following the last prohibited material application date. You can see an acronym here in the slide, DLPM, date of last prohibited material application. That's a shorthand we use at CCOF to talk about the date of the last prohibited material application. Other certifiers may use different acronyms, or lingo, but the idea is the same, which is that the documents you provide are going to need to describe the land use since that date, or for the past 3 years, if it was more than 3 years ago, because once that 3 years has passed, we don't need to verify anything more going beyond. And the documents you provide will also need to list all input materials applied since that date or for the past 3 years, whichever is later. And then hopefully this goes without saying, but if you have more than one field or ranch, you would need to repeat this process for each separate location. Moving on to seed and planting stock. I mentioned already that the prohibition on GMOs is a fundamental part of the organic regulations. This actually does have relevance in other areas of the regulations, but it's most directly related here to seed and planting stock, meaning that you cannot grow a GMO variety of any crop organically. So all seed and planting stock must be non-GMO. So secondly, organic seed is required unless you have searched with a variety of sources that are known to carry organic seed and find that there is no organic seed available that meets your needs. And this is what is referred to as a commercial availability search. If organic is commercially unavailable and you've established that by doing a thorough search of multiple sources, and you don't find any organic seed that meets your needs, then non-organic seed can be used. But again, it must be non-GMO. And then any seed treatments, so in this term, I'm including anything on the seed when it's planted. So that's not just your typical fungicide treatment, but also any inoculants, coatings, pelletings, anything like that. All of those must be approved for organic use, meaning all of the ingredients in that material need to be compliant. If you use any annual seedlings or transplants, those always must be certified organic. So there's actually no commercial availability exception when it comes to annual seedlings. So, vegetable transplants, for example. Any other types of planting stock other than annual seedlings, and now we're talking things like strawberry crowns, fruit trees, caneberry stock, that kind of thing, where it's not an annual grown from seed, the commercial availability requirement does apply there. So in the event that organic is unavailable, non-organic can be used. Moving on to soil management. So the requirements related to soil management begin with the principle of maintaining or improving the physical, chemical, and biological condition of the soil and minimizing erosion. Organic operations are also tasked with using crop rotation, cover crops, and the application of plant and animal materials to manage crop nutrients and soil fertility. So I want to stop for a moment on the crop rotation requirement because it's really a cornerstone of the soil management requirements as well as for pest management. And it must be implemented for any annual crop operation. So the purposes of the crop rotation are to maintain or improve soil organic matter, provide pest management, manage plant nutrients, and control erosion. And any operation growing annuals is going to need to demonstrate how they implement a rotation that complies with those key points. For a perennial operation like the orchard that you see here in the picture, farms need to use alternative practices that meet those same goals and introduce biological diversity into their systems. So in this picture, you see the nice cover crop in between the rows, which is how this farm, part of how this farm is meeting that requirement. There are also some specifics related to compost and raw manure. They get special mention in the organic regulations. Any compost that contains manure needs to be produced in a way that meets certain specifications for carbon to nitrogen ratio, temperatures, and turning in order to be applied at any moment within the organic production. If it hasn't met those specifications, it would be treated like raw manure, and raw manure has to be applied well before harvest, either 90 days before harvest or 120 days before harvest, depending on the crop. And you can imagine the food safety types of reasoning behind that requirement. Pest management. So here the organic regulations follow a basic IPM or integrated pest management hierarchy. First, there's a requirement to use preventative means, such as all of the cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that you see shown in this slide. Cultural practices like timing of planting or close attention to sanitation, biological controls like releases of beneficial insects, mechanical controls. Common ones we see are the bug vac, pruning and mowing, the row covers that exclude certain pests. So not every farm is, of course, going to use all the strategies you see here. Your specific considerations are going to guide you as to what practices you implement. But the point is that you're using prevention before you resort to application of organic approved pest control materials. And that brings us right to everybody's favorite topic, which is the materials. You're probably wondering when I was going to get here. So here we're going to talk about all materials applied to the land used to grow organic crops, or if you're producing transplants or crops in containers, all materials applied in those systems. So that's your fertilizers and soil amendments, compost, manure, all pest, weed, and disease control products, any adjuvants like spreader stickers, and any potting soil or growing media, and again, any seed treatments, meaning anything on the seed when it's planted. So there are also requirements for materials used on crops post-harvest, but that's outside the scope of this webinar. I'm happy to take questions from you on that later though. In short, all the ingredients in any input material need to be non-synthetic, which means essentially natural, naturally occurring, though there are a few exceptions that are prohibited, and these are things like strychnine, arsenic, and lead salts. Again, you can probably imagine the reasons why those are not allowed in organic. Or certain synthetic materials are allowed, but only if they are specifically listed in the regulations. So this is anything, basically anything produced by a chemical reaction would be considered synthetic. And some common examples here are elemental sulfur, micronutrients, and a number of other substances. And taken together, the list of what synthetics are allowed and what non-synthetics are prohibited is called the national list. So I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. All right, that was the technical breakdown on materials, but how it plays out in practice is more of concern to any beginning organic farmer. So the farmer is most likely going to be looking to apply a brand name product, some sort of formulated input that has multiple ingredients, like a fertilizer or pest control material that's available from the farm supply distributor or wherever you're going to obtain your input materials. So all of the ingredients in that product need to be reviewed by your certifier as part of your organic system plan so that the certifier can give you that thumbs up before you apply it. That's the insurance policy I've been talking about. At CCOF, what we do is after we review and approve materials for an operation, we give that operation a printout of their full list of approved materials, which is called the OSP materials list. It shows everything we've approved specifically for that operation. Other certifiers may do this differently in terms of how they notify you of approval, but the point is that applying a material that your certifier hasn't checked out does really put your certification at risk. So in order to do that review, the certifier needs documentation from the material manufacturer that discloses the names of all the ingredients in the formulated product. And the certifier is going to evaluate each ingredient one at a time based on that criteria I told you about on the previous slide. So based on the national list, is it non-synthetic? If so, is it on that short list of things that are prohibited? If it's synthetic, then is it on that short list of things that are allowed? So there are a lot of brand name products out there that are marketed to organic farms, and that brings us to the last point on this slide, which is that most certifiers also rely on some third-party material review organizations that have been recognized by the NOP to carry out organic material reviews. And these names might look familiar to some of you, maybe they're brand new to some of you, but if you're starting into the certification process, I encourage you to get familiar with them. OMRI is the Organic Material Review Institute. Washington State Department of Agriculture's organic program has an input review component, and then the CDFA has an organic input material review program, which looks at fertilizers marketed as organic in California. So these three organizations all have publicly available lists and databases that you can search. Anybody, anywhere with a web connection can search them. And you'll find there probably thousands of brand name formulated products that have been reviewed and approved for organic use. So this is a pretty key point for any operation that's waiting until the end of the 3-year transition to apply for certification. It's a great resource for those operations, especially if they're farming the land during that time. They can use these resources to get on track to find input materials that are approved. And again, if you do be in the certification process early in the transition, you actually have the benefit of your certifier signing off directly on every material you plan to use. And I will give you the links to OMRI, WSDA, and the CDFA's material program at the end. Okay, so we're moving into kind of a catch-all set of topics that are all control points where you as the organic farmer are going to be preventing prohibited materials from entering your organic system during crop production. And the first one, probably the one that gets the most attention, is how do you prevent drift of prohibited materials or other contact between prohibited materials and your organic parcels. So this is going to vary at every location, but in general, organic farms establish wide buffer spaces between the organic field and any neighboring fields where non-organic materials are applied. They might also use physical barriers like hedgerows or fences, and they generally take other safeguards like putting up signs, such as the one that you see here in the slide, and notifying neighbors. Some farms even have reached site-specific agreements with their neighbors, for example, about who's going to do weed management along a shared fence line and how that weed management is going to be done. So again, site-specific, each farm figures this out for their own situation. There are times when the farmer and the certifier identify that there is ongoing drift risk along a particular parcel boundary. So for example, let's say there's an organic vineyard that borders a non-organic almond orchard, and there's only a narrow farm road that separates them. The organic vineyard may have that last row of vines closest to the almonds designated as a buffer row, and the crops harvested from that row are sold as non-organic. And that's the last point on the slide here. Any high-risk buffer zones, if there's crops growing within them, those crops are going to need to be sold as non-organic. Now I'm going to try to answer a really common question that we get about buffers and drift, which is there a certain width required, like maybe 25 feet? And I think that 25 feet, it's a pretty common one that's out there. I think it comes from previous versions of organic regulations before the NOP was in place. But in the NOP regulations, there isn't actually a specific width that's that's prescribed. So the requirement is that the buffer zone needs to be sufficient to prevent contact with prohibited materials that are applied to neighboring land. So in other words, wide enough for whatever is going on at your site. And this is going to, take into account things like what the neighboring land use actually is, what type of materials are being applied. Maybe it's just fertilizers and not any pesticide spraying, how those materials are applied. You can imagine differences if the neighbor is using a backpack sprayer versus aerial applications, the prevailing wind direction, all kinds of site-specific factors. As the farmer, your responsibility is to evaluate what's going on, establish what you believe to be sufficient buffer zones, and then during the certification process that will be evaluated, and you may be asked to modify your buffer management practices, or they might be confirmed to be sufficient. So it's a team effort. Next, in the topic of control points, treated lumber. So treated lumber, whether it's used for fencing and posts, stakes, anything like that, cannot be used in an organic field. So anything pre-existing at your farm can stay in place. That is allowed. You don't have to rip out all the existing lumber that may be already installed if you have, a vineyard, for example, like what's pictured, or used lumber in some other way within your organic farm. But you cannot install anything new using treated wood at organic parcels. And another somewhat common point of questions is whether you can reuse existing treated lumber that came from somewhere else on your operation. And the answer is no, that cannot be reused for an organic field or parcel. Finally, mixed operations, which are those that have organic and non-organic production, have some additional control points they need to evaluate. And in all of these areas, they need to make sure to have preventative measures in place to ensure there's no contact between materials used for non-organic and their organic crops or fields. So those areas are the irrigation water, especially if the system is shared between organic and non-organic fields, the equipment used for material applications and for seeding and for harvest, and then finally the storage of input materials and how those are separated and labeled to reduce the risk that a non-organic material would be applied to the organic field. All right, getting to the labels. So if you plan to do any labeling, again, this is an important point where I want to stress that labels are part of an organic system plan that should be approved by the certifier before implementation, which in this case means before you go to print and spend a lot of money on labels that may have some feature that's out of compliance with the requirements. So the requirements are, and they're pretty straightforward when it comes to non-retail, like produce boxes or shipping bins. Essentially, for those types of labels, if your operation uses lot numbers, those need to be shown on the label. And beyond that, the label needs to be sufficient to identify the organic status of the product, whether you're using the word organic to do that, or using the lot numbering, or you have some other designation that preserves the organic integrity, or the organic identification, I should say, of the product. When it comes to retail labels, which is anything the consumer is going to take home, there's a requirement to identify the certifier, and this is by far the most common, I think, place where label errors come up. The statement is certified organic by, and then you name your certifier, or a phrase similar to that, and that needs to be located right below your operation name or contact information. So in this example here, you can see Copper Valley Foods. They've got all their contact information, and then it says certified organic by CCOF. This is just a sample label. But this is by far for retail labels the most common place people get tripped up is either leaving this off or not putting it right underneath the name of the operation. Couple more points on labels. Again, any certified organic product can use the certifier's logo. And most certified organic products can use the USDA organic seal that you see here. I say most because those made with organic wheat or oats or whatever, those kind of multi-ingredient processed products cannot use the seal, but any fresh produce can. So the USDA logo can only be used in the colors shown. Another common mistake is modifying it so that it's all green, for example, or some other color, but these are the two options. And then the other requirement for the seal is that if it's used along with the certifier logo cannot be more prominent. So essentially that means they can be the same size, or the certifier logo can be smaller, but not the other way around. And I'll give you some labeling guideline links that lay out all these specifics, so you don't need to remember them just from these slides. All right, moving on to a topic related to small to mid-sized farms that may be doing direct sales. So this could be farmers markets, and that's the examples I have here in the photos, but the same principles we're going to talk about apply to other direct sales like CSAs, farm stands, or online direct sales. The most important point is that if you're a mixed operation doing direct sales, meaning you're selling organic and non-organic, those need to be, first of all, clearly separated to prevent the organic and the non-organic from getting mixed up, and the term we use is commingling. And then finally, you need to make it very clear to consumers what is and is not organic, so identification of the product. So for example, a farmer's market operation that sells both organic and non-organic strawberries might use two different colored boxes. They might use yellow for the organic and white for the non-organic. This is pretty common, we see it a lot. And what this does is both helps the operation prevent commingling or mixing up the organic and non-organic, and it also helps the farm make clear to the consumer which berries are organic. They'll have all of the yellow boxes on one side of the table with a sign that says organic, and all of the white on the other side of the table with a sign that says non-organic. And then if you look at the photos here in the slide up close, you can see that this display does have pretty good identification in actually both pictures. The organic and the non-organic are clearly marked, but the second slide, or the second photo, does have a commingling issue. The organic and the non-organic are mixing together. So that's what makes that one not compliant. And then lastly, I just want to touch again on the exemption for very small operations making less than $5,000 a year in annual sales. Those operations can make claims of organic without being certified, but anyone else making organic claims in any kind of direct market venue like a farmer's market does need to be certified. And what that means is that similar statements like organically grown are not allowed unless your operation is exempt. A common question we hear is about phrases like pesticide free or no spray, and those types of statements, they don't use the word organic specifically, but they can be misleading to consumers, and for that reason, there are a number of farmers markets that have rules that prohibit the use of those types of terms. So if you're selling at a farmer's market, you need to be aware of what your market rules are. All right, so we've wrapped up the regulations that relate to crop production and direct sales from the NOP. And at this point, I want to take a quick detour, and this is our last topic before we go to questions, into a couple areas that can be points of confusion for organic producers, specifically in California. And that's the distinction between organic certification, organic registration, and the certified producer's certificate. So organic producers in California need to register with the state organic program, and that's even the exempt operations with less than $5,000 in sales. And the registration process involves an application and a registration fee that I mentioned earlier, but it does differ from certification in that it doesn't require an inspection or an organic system plan, so it's much less complex. And then operations selling at farmers markets in California need to obtain a certified producer's certificate, which has no bearing on the organic status of the product, but is essentially a verification that the producer is selling what they grew, or in some cases, what they obtained from maybe a nearby farm. So, but again, that has no bearing on organic. So three different layers that may or may not apply to your operation. And if that's clear as mud, you can check out the links that I'll give you at the end. And now we are there. This first slide of links takes you to some resources specific to the National Organic Program. And don't feel that you need to write all these down because you have the PDF, and we will also email these all out to you. So the last link is how to find an accredited certifier. CCOF, again, is one of many. There's nearly 50 certifiers in the US that are accredited to certify to the USDA National Organic Program. So we really encourage you to do your homework and find the certifier that's the best fit for you. And this is the place you would do that. Start doing that, I should say. On this page, you'll find general information on becoming organic, some information on production practices, cost share, and material review. Here we've got some links on natural resources, those sample record keeping forms and labeling guides that I promised you. And then finally, some resources for farmers specifically in California about the registration and the certified producer certificate. And then some Spanish language resources on organic from NCAT ATRA and from CCOF. And now, some last questions.
Great. Well, thank you for that overview. So we had some questions come in while you were giving your presentation, and one was going back to the land requirements. What are the certification requirements for land that has never had chemicals applied? So if it's been fallow for a really long time.
Yeah.
Specifically kind of about the affidavit.
That's a great question. And that's pretty common for people to bring in land that has been sitting fallow for 3 years or more. The requirement is just that you're able to document that it has been sitting fallow for that period of time and has had no materials applied to it. So in CCOF's organic system plan, we provide essentially an affidavit of land history that you or whoever was managing the land during that time would fill out and sign to attest that that's what's been going on. If you're looking at other certifiers, OSPs, you'll see that they ask for that information in potentially a different way, but it's going to come down to having a signed document that establishes that this was the land use and that nothing was applied.
Great, thank you. And then someone else wrote in, as we mentioned before, there's certifiers all over the United States, and they were curious if they're getting certified by a certifier that's located in California or Oregon, and they're in Nebraska. Will the forms and resources provided by the certifier be applicable to their area?
Let me see if I understand the question. Oh, I see. If I'm in Nebraska, but I'm looking at getting certified by a certifier in Oregon,
yeah,
will that be applicable?
Will the OSP forms be applicable?
Yes, that should be the case. The goal of putting together our OSP forms is to gather the information we need from any operation anywhere that we might be certifying. And for example, CCOF works with farms across the United States in almost all 50 states at this point, and throughout Mexico. Other certifiers are more localized or have a more global scope of where they work. So yes, that should be the case.
Great, thanks. And then we also had a question about hemp seed and transplants. And given that there's not a lot of organic hemp seed out there, how kind of is that handled for organic certification in terms of seed or starting plant?
Yeah, so hemp, of course, is a sort of newly developing and evolving area, regulatory speaking, in terms of just growing it legally in California and other states. As far as organic goes, there's no difference in how we would evaluate your seed search and your compliance with the seed requirements if you're growing hemp or anything else. I think the question actually sort of already points out that there is a limitation on available hemp seed, so that's organic. So that's going to be part of what an operation that grows hemp from seed is going to document and establish as part of their commercial availability evaluation that they do. So they might, if there's seed suppliers they could search with that may offer organic hemp seed, they might make those calls. If there's organic, if there's trialing going on of growing some non-organic variety or not that is available non-organically into organic seed, that might be part of evaluating. There's a lot of different ways that an operation could establish whether organic seed for their operation is commercially available.
Okay, great. And then also the non-GMO.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and that non-GMO requirement applies to any type of seed.
All right, great. Thank you. And then someone was also wondering, just curious to know why the records need to be kept for 5 years.
That's a good question. I can speculate on that. I can't give you an exact answer. My best guess is that it has to do with the ability of the certifier or the NOP to go back and look at records from, that somewhat distant time in the past in the event of some kind of investigation or compliance and enforcement action that might be going on. That's my best guess.
All right, thanks. And then going back to when you were talking about the control points and the treated wood requirements, someone was wondering, what about hoop houses with linseed oil?
Right, linseed oil most likely would be allowed because it's, I believe, non-synthetic. Don't want you to quote me on that because you would want your certifier to review the specific product that you're looking at and see if there's any additives or other ingredients in there that might exclude it from being considered an allowed material.
Okay, great. So check in with your certifier, as with everything, before using new materials. And then, let's see it. We had another question about the CDFA registration. And do I have to re-register with CDFA yearly as an organic producer?
Yes, that is an annual process. So there's a CDFA renewal cycle, just like the organic certification renewal cycle.
Great. And then someone else was wondering, are cover crops mandatory for perennial flower production?
So cover crops are mentioned broadly within the soil and fertility management practices under the regulations. So cover crops are going to be part of how some operations implement a crop rotation. For the perennial producers, like I mentioned, cover crops might be how they meet the requirements in that area for their operation. I will say that cover crops are, always highly encouraged. There may be some systems where cover cropping doesn't make sense, if there's water constraints or other constraints on using them. So for the specific example, sorry, that was annual.
Perennial flower production.
Perennial flower production. That might certainly be a way to meet the requirements for perennial flower production or any other perennial. There could be other methods that farms might use to meet those same requirements, which again are to introduce biodiversity into the system, break pest cycles, increase soil organic matter content, control erosion, and control excess plant nutrients, I believe. I hope I got that.
Good memory. All right, thank you. And then if someone has particular questions about their operation and they want to talk to a certifier directly about transitioning to organic, what's the best way to go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've got a set of folks here at CCOF who are available to talk to any applicant or potential applicant who has questions, and we'll give you some contact information for them at the end of this presentation. You could also just call the main line. And then for other certifiers, I don't know if they have specific staff designated for fielding questions, but I encourage you to go ahead and call their main lines or email them and see who they would connect you with.
Great, thank you. And then we also had a question about how organic product, or what are the organic product integrity requirements, sort of tracking things through the supply chain.
So this is, if I understand the question right, this is getting more into the post-harvest realm. So let's say you're sending your crops to, let's say you grow walnuts and you're sending them to a huller. That huller would need to be certified organic because they're handling an organic crop. And then all the way down the supply chain, excluding the final retail vendor, that whole supply chain needs to be certified. And I should say, I'm sorry, I'll back that up a little bit. Brokers and distributors are also exempt from certification if they don't actually handle the product in any way. They're just distributing already final packed product. But anyone who is handling it in any way, and that means packing, repacking, labeling, really anything else you can think of that involves touching the product, all of those operations need to be certified. And the handling part of the regulations that I didn't cover in this presentation would apply in those phases.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you. So let's see, going back to the hemp question, just to clarify, seed genetics in specific for hemp would be considered non-organic. Only organic seeds meet the, or is it that only organic seeds meet the non-GMO requirements?
So for the non-GMO requirements, that applies to any type of seed you use. In practice, we know that there's only certain types of seed that there's only certain crops that are available in GMO form. So, things like corn, soy, cotton, those are kind of the main ones, alfalfa as well, sugar beets. So those crops absolutely need to demonstrate non-GMO status. First, if you're growing a crop like hemp or, just looking at the slide here, any of those berries shown on the screen, none of those are available in GMO form. So the non-GMO verification is sort of the same as saying, well, I grow this crop that's not available in a GMO form. A lot of seed suppliers have that language just all over their website, so it's really clear and easy. If you have any question about what crops are available in GMO form or not, and what type of documentation you would want to look for a specific crop, feel free to contact your certifier. But in general, go ahead and ask for that from your supplier for any crop you plant. In the majority of cases, their answer is going to be, well, this doesn't exist in GMO form.
All right, well, thank you very much. I think we're going to wrap things up. Again, if you have any questions we didn't get to or want some more specifics for specific situations to your operation, feel free to follow up with us after the webinar. And Rebecca's contact information is there, and we also have the foundation contact information. So again, Rebecca, thank you for joining us this afternoon and giving us a very thorough overview of organic certification and some things to keep in mind as you move through the transition process. So just to note some other upcoming events we have, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have some other webinars in our farmers marketing series, and the next one coming up is the Assessing Crop Profitability for Farm Business Planning webinar, and that will kind of get into the weeds about looking at the profitability of different crops and how you can use that information to figure out what's bringing in the most revenue for your operation and how to plan around that. So that will be at the end of October. And then we have some other events that are not in the Farmers Marketing Series, but you are still wrapping your head around food safety for small to mid-sized farms. We have a great webinar in November that's going to go over some of the frequently asked questions about food safety and kind of clarify some misconceptions that might be out there. So that's a good one. And then in December, the CCOF and the Organic Produce Network are co-hosting the Organic Grower Summit in Monterey. So that's a great event to connect with a bunch of people in person, and they have a lot of really good panels and whatnot as well. Also, if you have any high school students in your life, the CCOF Foundation Future Organic Farmer Grant Fund is now accepting applications for organic-focused FFA supervised agricultural experience projects, and the deadline for those is November 15th. And you can find more information about that on our website. And it's always really exciting to see all the great projects that the high school students put together. So we encourage lots of folks to apply. And then if you could fill out your evaluation form that'll pop up once the webinar closes. We always love to hear your feedback, get ideas for future programming, as well as how to improve our offerings. And thank you again for being with us here today. It's always a pleasure to spend an afternoon going over different agricultural topics. So we hope you found it informative. So thanks, and have a good day.